This book begins not with theory but with loss. Loss of freedom, loss of dignity, loss of certainty. Viktor Frankl does not introduce himself as a philosopher or a psychologist first. He introduces himself as a man who has been stripped of everything that once gave his life structure and meaning. Career, home, family, identity, gone in an instant. What remains is the question that frames the entire book. When everything is taken from a person, what is left? Frankl's story unfolds inside the Nazi concentration camps, but he does not describe them for shock or spectacle. He describes them as laboratories of the human spirit, places where human beings were reduced to numbers, where survival was uncertain, and where suffering was constant. In such conditions, the illusions of normal life disappear. Comfort, status, ambition, and security no longer matter. Only the most essential questions remain. One of the first realizations Frankl describes is how quickly external freedom can be removed, and how unprepared most people are for that loss. Prisoners arrived believing the nightmare would end soon. They held on to hope that rescue or release was imminent. This hope sustained them at first, but it was also dangerous. When reality contradicted expectation again and again, disappointment crushed the spirit. Hope without grounding became a liability. Frankl observed that suffering was not distributed evenly. Everyone endured hunger, cold, exhaustion, and humiliation, yet people responded differently. Some collapsed quickly. Others endured far beyond what seemed possible. Physical strength did not determine survival. Intelligence did not guarantee resilience. Something deeper was at work. The camp stripped away social masks. Titles meant nothing. Achievements had no value. People were reduced to their inner core. Frankl noticed that when external identities vanished, inner attitudes became decisive. Those who clung only to past status suffered intensely. Those who adapted inwardly found ways to endure. One of the most devastating losses Frankl describes is the loss of loved ones. Many prisoners learned, often suddenly, that their families had been killed. Grief was overwhelming, yet even here Frankl makes a striking observation. Love, he realized, is not dependent on physical presence. The memory of a loved one, the inner dialogue with them, could sustain a person even when everything else was gone. Frankl writes that in moments of extreme suffering, the mind seeks refuge in meaning. People who could not find meaning in their suffering often broke down. Those who could connect their suffering to a purpose, however abstract, found strength they did not know they possessed. Meaning did not remove pain, but it made pain bearable. The book challenges a deeply held assumption that happiness is the goal of life. In the camps, happiness was impossible, comfort was absent, pleasure was non-existent, yet some prisoners maintained inner dignity. Frankl argues that life is not primarily about happiness but about meaning. Happiness is a byproduct of meaning, not its source. Frankl describes moments when prisoners faced a choice that no one else could make for them. They could become brutal, selfish, and cruel in order to survive. Or they could retain humanity, compassion, and moral integrity, even at great cost. Not everyone chose the higher path, but those who did demonstrated something extraordinary. Even in absolute deprivation, humans retain the freedom to choose their attitude. This is one of the book's most powerful insights. Everything can be taken from a person except one thing, the freedom to choose how to respond. This freedom is not external. It exists internally. Even when circumstances are unchangeable, attitude remains a choice. That choice determines whether suffering destroys or transforms. Frankl observed that some prisoners became indistinguishable from their oppressors. They adopted cruelty as a defense. Others became unexpectedly kind, sharing scraps of bread, offering comfort, or giving encouragement. These acts were small, but in the camps, they were profound. They proved that humans are not defined solely by conditions. The author also notes how future orientation influenced survival. Prisoners who lost any sense of future purpose often deteriorated rapidly. When a person believed there was nothing left to live for, the body soon followed the mind. Conversely, those who held onto a task unfinished, a responsibility waiting, or a meaning yet to be fulfilled endured far longer. Frankl himself survived by holding onto meaning beyond the camps. He imagined rebuilding his work, rewriting his lost manuscript, and sharing what he had learned. These imagined futures gave him a reason to endure present suffering. Meaning anchored him when hope alone was fragile. The book emphasizes that suffering is unavoidable in life, but despair is optional. Despair arises when suffering appears meaningless. When meaning is found, suffering becomes a challenge rather than a curse. This does not glorify pain, it dignifies endurance. Frankl is careful to note that suffering is not necessary for meaning. Meaning can be found in love, work, and creation. But when suffering cannot be avoided, meaning can still be found in how one bears it. This idea does not excuse cruelty. It restores agency to the victim. Toward the end of this first part, Frankl reflects on how the camps revealed the essence of humanity. They showed that under extreme pressure, people become either more human or less. Circumstances do not determine character. Choices do. The first part closes with a quiet but profound realization. Life asks something of us, even in suffering. The question is not what we expect from life, but what life expects from us. When this question is answered sincerely, meaning emerges, even in the darkest places. Part 2. Logotherapy, meaning, and why pleasure and power are not enough. After establishing that human beings retain the freedom to choose their attitude even in the most extreme suffering, the book turns from personal testimony towards psychological insight. Frankl does not present theory detached from experience. His ideas emerge directly from what he witnessed and endured. The question he seeks to answer is deceptively simple. If meaning is what sustained people in the camps, what exactly is meaning, and how does it function in ordinary life? Frankl begins by challenging two dominant psychological views of human motivation. One argues that people are driven primarily by pleasure, seeking to avoid pain and maximize comfort. Another claims that people are driven by power, striving for dominance, success, or recognition. Frankl does not deny that pleasure and power influence behavior, but he argues they are secondary. When life feels empty, neither pleasure nor power is sufficient to sustain the human spirit. In the camps, pleasure was absent and power non-existent. Yet some people survived with inner strength intact. This observation led Frankl to a radical conclusion. The primary human drive is not pleasure or power, but meaning. People are motivated most deeply by the desire to find meaning in their lives. When meaning is present, suffering becomes tolerable. When meaning is absent, even comfort feels hollow. This insight forms the foundation of logotherapy, Frankl's psychological approach. Logotherapy focuses not on past causes, but on future meaning. Instead of asking why a person suffers, it asks what the suffering demands of them. Instead of analyzing childhood endlessly, it directs attention toward responsibility and purpose. Frankl emphasizes that meaning is not invented arbitrarily. It is discovered. Life presents each person with unique tasks, challenges, and responsibilities. Meaning arises from responding to these demands. It cannot be handed down as a universal formula. What gives one person meaning may leave another untouched. Meaning is personal, situational, and dynamic. The book outlines three primary ways meaning is found. The first is through creative work, what a person gives to the world through contribution, service, or creation. This does not require grand achievement. Even small acts of responsibility can carry deep meaning. What matters is engagement, not scale. The second path to meaning is through love. Frankl describes love not as emotion alone, but as the ability to see the potential in another human being. Love allows a person to transcend themselves. Even in the camps, where physical presence was often impossible, the inner experience of love sustained people. Remembering a loved one, imagining their face, or feeling responsibility toward them provided purpose beyond survival. The third path to meaning is through suffering. This is the most misunderstood and most difficult form. Frankl is careful to clarify that suffering is not necessary for meaning, nor is it inherently valuable. But when suffering cannot be avoided, meaning can still be found in how it is endured. The attitude taken toward unavoidable suffering can transform it into a human achievement. Frankl strongly rejects the idea that mental health is the absence of tension. He argues that a certain level of tension is not only healthy, but necessary. Tension between what one is and what one ought to become creates direction. When tension disappears entirely, life loses vitality. Meaning gives tension structure rather than chaos. The book introduces the concept of the existential vacuum, a state of inner emptiness that arises when people lack meaning. This vacuum often appears in modern life, where basic needs are met but existential questions are ignored. People attempt to fill this emptiness with pleasure, distraction, or conformity, but these substitutes fail to satisfy deeply. Frankl observed that many psychological symptoms, depression, addiction, aggression, are not merely medical problems but expressions of meaninglessness. When life feels pointless, people seek stimulation or escape. Logotherapy addresses these symptoms by helping individuals reconnect with purpose rather than suppressing discomfort alone. Another important idea introduced here is responsibility. Frankl emphasizes that meaning is always tied to responsibility. Life is not something that owes us satisfaction. It is something that questions us. Each situation asks something specific of us, and we are responsible for answering through action. This perspective reverses the common question people ask. Instead of asking, "What can I expect from life?" Frankl urges asking, "What does life expect from me?" This shift restores agency. It places the individual in an active role rather than a passive one. The book also discusses the danger of reductionism, the tendency to reduce humans to biological or psychological mechanisms. Frankl argues that such reduction strips life of dignity. Humans are not merely products of instinct or environment. They are meaning-seeking beings capable of self-transcendence. Frankl emphasizes that logotherapy does not promise happiness. Happiness cannot be pursued directly. It emerges as a side effect of meaning. When people chase happiness itself, they often become more dissatisfied. When they pursue meaning, happiness follows naturally. The author also addresses guilt and responsibility. Guilt, when properly understood, is not something to eliminate entirely. It signals awareness of responsibility. Healthy guilt motivates correction and growth. Meaningful life includes acknowledging mistakes and choosing differently moving forward. Another theme in this part is the uniqueness of each moment. Meaning is not abstract or permanent. It changes from moment to moment. What mattered yesterday may not matter today. Life demands flexibility and attentiveness. Meaning must be discovered repeatedly, not assumed once and for all. Frankl also explains that meaning cannot be imposed by others. Advice, ideology, or social pressure cannot replace personal discovery. Attempts to impose meaning often lead to resentment or emptiness. True meaning resonates internally because it aligns with individual responsibility. Toward the end of this section, Frankl returns to the camp experience to reinforce his theory. He recalls how prisoners who believed they had something left to accomplish, a loved one waiting, a task unfinished, a truth to share, endured longer than those who believed their future was empty. Meaning sustained life when hope alone was fragile. The section closes with a powerful conclusion. Life is meaningful under all circumstances, even the most miserable ones. This does not justify suffering, but it affirms human dignity. Meaning is not removed by pain, loss, or injustice. It is challenged, and in that challenge it reveals itself. Part 3. Responsibility, choice, and becoming worthy of suffering. As Frankl's argument deepens, the focus shifts from meaning as an abstract idea to meaning as a lived responsibility. Meaning, he insists, is not something to be discussed endlessly or admired intellectually. It is something to be answered. Life, in every moment, asks a question, and each person answers not with words but with action. This framing places responsibility at the center of human existence. Frankl explains that responsibility is inseparable from freedom. The freedom he speaks of is not external liberty, which can be taken away, but inner freedom, the ability to choose one's response. This freedom cannot be removed, even in the most restrictive circumstances. But freedom without responsibility becomes meaningless. Responsibility gives freedom direction. It turns choice into purpose. The camps revealed this truth with brutal clarity. Prisoners faced countless moments where they had no control over conditions, yet they retained control over how they met those conditions. They could surrender to bitterness or preserve dignity. They could abandon moral restraint or hold onto humanity. These choices were often small, invisible to others, but they defined the person who made them. Frankl is careful not to romanticize suffering. He does not claim that suffering ennobles everyone or that it should be sought. Suffering, he insists, is never valuable in itself. What matters is the stance a person takes toward unavoidable suffering. When suffering can be avoided, it should be avoided. When it cannot, it becomes a test of character rather than a sentence of despair. This leads to one of Frankl's most challenging ideas: becoming worthy of one's suffering. This does not mean justifying pain or accepting injustice. It means refusing to let suffering reduce one's humanity. When a person bears suffering with courage, dignity, and responsibility, suffering is transformed. It becomes a human achievement rather than a meaningless blow. Frankl observed that many prisoners lost the will to live not because of physical exhaustion, but because of inner collapse. When a person believed there was nothing left to answer for, no responsibility remaining, the body soon followed the mind. Responsibility, even toward an imagined future, sustained life when comfort and hope failed. He describes how people often cling to the idea that life should be fair. When life violates this expectation, resentment grows. Frankl challenges this assumption directly. Life is not fair, and waiting for fairness only deepens despair. Meaning does not depend on fairness. It depends on response. The book emphasizes that meaning is always specific. It does not exist in general slogans or universal truths. Each situation presents a unique demand. What is required in one moment may not be required in the next. This is why meaning cannot be reduced to rules. It must be discovered through attentiveness. Frankl also addresses the temptation of nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent meaning. This belief often arises as a defense against disappointment. If nothing matters, then nothing can hurt. But nihilism, Frankl argues, strips life of responsibility and reduces human existence to survival alone. This reduction creates emptiness rather than protection. Another key insight in this section is that suffering often reveals values. When everything unnecessary is stripped away, what remains becomes visible. In the camps, people learned quickly what truly mattered: love, integrity, inner freedom. Comfort and ambition faded. Meaning clarified under pressure. Frankl explains that responsibility also extends to how we view the past. People often believe their past failures define them permanently. Frankl rejects this. The past is not something that imprisons us. It is something that calls us to responsibility. What we have done cannot be undone, but how we respond to it now remains open. Guilt, in this framework, is not an enemy to be eliminated at all costs. It is a signal of responsibility recognized. Healthy guilt motivates change. Meaningful life includes acknowledging mistakes and choosing differently moving forward. Avoiding guilt entirely often leads to avoidance of responsibility. Frankl also discusses the relationship between responsibility and future orientation. People who live meaningfully orient themselves toward tasks yet to be completed, values yet to be lived, and responsibilities yet to be fulfilled. This future orientation does not deny present suffering, it contextualizes it. Suffering becomes something endured for the sake of something beyond itself. The book returns again to the idea that humans are capable of self-transcendence. Self-transcendence means reaching beyond oneself toward a cause, a person, or a responsibility. Meaning emerges not from introspection alone, but from engagement with something greater than the self. When attention turns outward, suffering loses some of its grip. Frankl also addresses the danger of reducing life to psychological comfort. A life aimed only at comfort avoids challenge and responsibility. Without responsibility, meaning withers. Psychological health, in Frankl's view, does not come from eliminating all tension, but from carrying meaningful tension, the pull toward values not yet fully realized. Another powerful idea introduced here is that suffering exposes choice more sharply than comfort ever could. In comfort, choices are blurred by convenience. In suffering, choices become stark. How one responds under pressure reveals character. This revelation can be frightening, but it is also clarifying. Frankl recounts moments in the camps where prisoners were faced with choices that seemed insignificant but carried moral weight. Whether to share food, whether to comfort another, whether to maintain honesty. These choices did not change the system, but they changed the person making them. Meaning lived in these moments. The author also emphasizes that meaning is not a guarantee against despair. Even those with strong purpose experience doubt and exhaustion. Meaning does not remove pain. It provides a reason to endure it. This distinction is essential. Meaning is not a shield, it is a compass. Toward the end of this part, Frankl reflects on the idea of inner freedom again. Inner freedom does not mean detachment from emotion. It means refusing to let circumstance dictate moral stance. Even when emotions surge, choice remains. The section closes with a sober but empowering realization. Life does not promise happiness or justice. It promises responsibility. Each moment demands an answer. When a person answers sincerely, through courage, dignity, and commitment, life becomes meaningful, even in suffering. Meaning is not something we are given. It is something we are asked to live. Part 4, Transcendence, Love, and the Meaning that Outlives Suffering. As the book reaches its final movement, Frankl turns toward the most enduring question of all. What remains when suffering ends? And what endures even when it does not. Having explored meaning through suffering, responsibility, and choice, he now reveals the deepest dimension of human existence, self-transcendence. This is the capacity to move beyond oneself, beyond pain, beyond circumstance, toward something greater than the self. In Frankl's view, this capacity is what makes life meaningful even in the face of death. Frankl explains that human beings are not fulfilled by self-absorption. Happiness does not come from constant attention to one's own emotional state. In fact, the more a person focuses on themselves, on their happiness, comfort, or suffering, the more dissatisfied they often become. Meaning emerges when attention moves outward, toward a task, a responsibility, or another human being. This outward orientation is the essence of self-transcendence. The camps revealed this truth with stark clarity. Prisoners who focused solely on survival often lost their inner strength. Those who oriented themselves toward something beyond survival, a loved one, a future task, a moral stance, retained inner freedom even as their bodies weakened. Frankl emphasizes that life asks each person to transcend themselves in different ways, and that meaning is found precisely in answering that call. Love, Frankl explains, is one of the most powerful expressions of self-transcendence. Love is not merely an emotion or attachment. It is the ability to see the unique potential of another person and to affirm their value. Even when separated from loved ones, prisoners who held them in mind were sustained by that inner connection. Love, in this sense, was not dependent on physical presence. It existed as an inner reality that no guard or barbed wire could remove. Frankl describes moments when thinking of his wife, without knowing whether she was alive or dead, gave him strength to endure. In those moments, he realized that love transcends physical existence. The essence of a person lives in memory, meaning, and responsibility. To love someone is to carry their presence within you, regardless of circumstance. This insight leads to one of the book's most profound conclusions. The meaning of life is unconditional. It does not disappear with suffering, loss, or death. It changes form. When creative work is impossible, meaning may be found in love. When love is separated by loss, meaning may be found in the stance one takes toward suffering. Life never stops asking questions, even when answers are painful. Frankl also addresses death directly. Awareness of mortality, he argues, does not render life meaningless. It gives life urgency and weight. If life were endless, actions would lose significance. Mortality sharpens responsibility. Each moment matters precisely because it cannot be repeated. The book challenges the fear that suffering renders life pointless. Frankl insists that suffering does not negate meaning, it demands it. The question is not why suffering exists, but how one responds to it. This response becomes part of one's legacy, something that cannot be undone. Frankl introduces the idea that the past is the safest form of being. What has been lived meaningfully can never be taken away. Even when life is reduced to memory, the past remains real. Acts of courage, love, and dignity are preserved forever in the reality of having happened. This idea offers comfort in the face of loss. Nothing meaningful is ever wasted. He also reflects on the danger of collective thinking that erases individuality. The camps demonstrated how easily systems reduce people to numbers. Frankl's psychology resists this reduction. Meaning is always personal. Responsibility cannot be delegated. Each person must answer life in their own way. Frankl emphasizes that even after liberation, suffering does not simply end. Survivors faced new challenges: grief, guilt, disorientation, and emptiness. Freedom itself became overwhelming. This reveals another truth: meaning must be rediscovered repeatedly. It is not a single revelation but an ongoing task. The book also warns against the illusion that happiness can be engineered. Happiness cannot be pursued directly. When people chase happiness, they often become more anxious and dissatisfied. Happiness emerges as a side effect of meaning. It arrives quietly when a person is absorbed in something worthwhile. Frankl explains that despair arises not from pain itself, but from pain without meaning. When suffering feels pointless, it becomes unbearable. When it is integrated into a meaningful narrative, it becomes survivable. Meaning does not eliminate grief, but it prevents despair from consuming the soul. Another key insight in this final part is the role of attitude. Even when all external freedoms are removed, attitude remains. This inner stance toward life determines whether suffering dehumanizes or deepens. Frankl insists that no situation is so bleak that it robs a person of the freedom to choose their response. The book also addresses modern life, where meaninglessness often appears not through extreme suffering, but through comfort and conformity. When life lacks challenge and responsibility, emptiness grows. Frankl warns that the absence of struggle can be just as dangerous to the human spirit as suffering without meaning. He emphasizes that meaning is not something that must be grand or heroic. It often appears in small responsibilities, daily choices, and quiet commitments. Meaning is not measured by recognition. It is measured by sincerity. Toward the end of the book, Frankl returns to the idea that life questions us. We are not the judges of life. Life is the judge of us. Our answers are given through action, courage, and integrity. Each moment presents a demand, and each response shapes who we become. The final message of the book is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It is realistic and dignified. Life will include suffering, loss, and uncertainty, but it also offers meaning under all conditions. The task is not to avoid suffering at all costs, but to meet it with responsibility and humanity. Frankl closes with a quiet affirmation. Even in the darkest circumstances, life retains meaning. Even when suffering is unavoidable, dignity remains possible. And even when everything is taken away, the freedom to choose one's attitude remains intact. That freedom to choose meaning is the last and greatest human freedom. And that is man's search for meaning.